We'll be recording this. Today, we're going to be discussing how to manage student loan debt if you have student loan debt already. Um, the disclaimer is that even though we'll be talking about some legal issues, I just want to make it clear that we're not developing an attorney-client relationship with this seminar. We're going to be giving more information at the end of the talk if you have any questions. What I would like to do is have people put their questions in the chat. And the best way to do this is probably to go at the end and go through the questions. So feel free to enter them as you think about them. And then at the end of the talk, we'll go through each of your questions. As I said, this is a discussion about how to manage your student loan debt. I'm Mary Day. I'm a staff attorney at Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, and we look forward to helping you today. All right. Most people are probably fairly well aware that the student loan debt is quite burdensome. It's a huge impact on society, and it's the second debt that is held in the United States, the first being home loans for mortgages. Currently, the amount of money that's being held with student loan debt is $1.7 trillion. So you can imagine it's quite a huge motivation for people to get involved in holding the student loan debt. As I said, it's the second largest debt of consumer debt after mortgages. Currently, there's about 45 million Americans who hold student loan debts, and most of the people by far who graduate have student loan debt. It particularly impacts people of color. This is a sobering statistic about Black people who started college in the middle of the 1990s. 95% of those people still have student loan debt. The current issue right now is we're starting to see delinquencies and defaults because there were some protections during the pandemic. So the percentage of people is growing, but currently 25% of all student borrowers are in either delinquency or default. And we'll talk about what that means, what the difference between. Another issue is that seniors, older people, are really experience quite a bit of a burden with student loan debt because it's just not being paid off. And so $28 billion of people Americans over 71 years old have student loan debt. How does student loan debt burden people, affect their lives? It affects their ability to purchase a home. It affects their ability to start a business. If you go into default, it can attack your wage earnings, affect your credit score, and as I mentioned, it will affect your ability to plan for your retirement. This is the agenda today. We're going to first start discussing what to do, or first we'll discuss the type of student loans. Gets a little bit confusing, so I hope you had your coffee or your tea because this entire discussion is fairly complicated. There was an effort to try to make it clear and cleaner, but it is very, very complex. All right, so there's two basic types of student loans. There's federal loans. Those are loans that are owned by the Department of Education, the entity in the United States government. And then there's another type entirely, which is treated completely different, which are private loans. Those are loans that are presented by banks, the schools, sometimes credit unions. You'll see names like Sally Mae, SoFi, Earnest. Those are private student loans. And the way that you can figure out pretty quickly which one you have is for the private student loans, those are pretty much going to show up on your credit report. There's a link here that shows how you can get a credit report for free. That's annualcreditreport.com. If you look through those credit reports, and I suggest you look at all three, you can see if your private student loans are going to show up. Your federal loans, you have to go to a website called studentaid.gov. We're going to talk about that a lot. You have to register on that website. You have to get a handshake with the Department of Education before you can start accessing that website. But that's going to be the portal, the place where you find out everything you want to know about your federal student loans. And if you go there, you can look at your dashboard and you can see right away what kind of student loans you have and what percentage of your total debt. Currently, most loans are what they call direct loans. Those are labeled as direct loans, and those are like kind of the Cadillac of all loans because they have a lot of options available to you if you have just direct loans. But there's some older loans like FFEL loans, Federal Family Education Loans, Parent Plus loans, and Perkins loans. We'll talk about that through the talk, but those have less options available if those are the type of loans that you have. Okay, how student loans are managed is there's the lender, there's the Department of Education, there's the bank, or there's the people who are managing the debt because they've taken it over from somebody else, which is called a guarantee agency. Um, those are the people that own the debt, but the people that you usually interact with is the servicer. Those are the people that they're kind of like the teller at a bank where they're taking your payments, they're telling you what, your account balance is. And those are people such as Mohila, Ed Financial, Aidvantage. Those are the servicers. They don't own the debt, but they are the people that you work with when you're trying to make payments or trying to figure out what your debt options are. If you go into default, then you might be interacting with a debt collector. Both private and federal loans have debt collector capabilities, and those people will only contact you to collect the debt. They normally don't have the ability to negotiate or help you with any kind of repayment plans. Okay, we're going to talk about when it's difficult for you to make the payments that you are being demanded to make. All right, so we're going to be talking about federal loans to start with. At the end of this talk, we'll talk about private loans, but from now on throughout this webinar, we're going to be talking about just federal debt. That's debt owed to the Department of Education. It's really, really, really important that the earlier you address any issues you're having with either not making payments or being in default, the earlier you reach out to get help, the better your options are. So basically, when you don't make a payment on a federal student loan, you become delinquent. That means you're classified as delinquent. After 270 days of being delinquent, you then are considered in default. And that's where the federal government will start exercising their options to collect on that debt. So 270 days, they're going to start taking action. The things that the federal government can do to collect on that debt is pretty powerful. They can intercept any of your tax refunds. They can take your wages, partial part of your wages, up to 15% of your disposable pay. That's the amount that you are getting paid after most of the deductions. They can also offset federal benefits such as Social Security. They can take up to 15% of those benefits, and they will report your loans in default to the credit bureaus. If you are in default, you won't have access. You won't be able to take out any new federal student aid. And you won't be able to choose a repayment plan or ask for deferment or forbearance. There is a little bit of a trick because currently those people that were in default before the pandemic and weren't able to get out of default, they are currently moving those loans from their current servicer into the default servicer. It's kind of like this transfer that's taking place, and it takes a little bit of time, maybe a month or so. And during that transfer, you have the ability to get out of default quickly by asking for a retroactive forbearance. If you find yourself in default, if you know you've gone 270 days, it's really important you reach out to legal aid, such as our organization or any other legal aid organization, and get active on trying to get your loan caught before it gets transferred to the default servicer. Okay, some of you have probably experienced either deferment or forbearance on your loans. Deferment is where you have certain categories, such as, you've had unemployment or you've got a financial hardship. You've been suffering from a medical illness such as cancer. You're in the military. You can get a deferment. That's a little bit different than forbearance. Forbearance, you basically call up your servicer and say, I'm having trouble. And more or less, it's sort of automatic to be put in forbearance. For both of those conditions, you typically will accrue interest with your unsubsidized loans. And what that means is your loan's getting more expensive while you're in deferment and forbearance. The only exception to that is subsidized loans. Those are loans that don't accrue interest during deferments. There's some changes coming to the forbearance possibilities, and we'll talk about that down the road. But you should look at both of these as really just an emergency action, because during that time, like I said, you're really not getting a benefit. You're just not having to make payments, but there may be other ways for you to not have to make payments besides deferment and forbearance, which might not cause your loan to balloon and become more expensive because the interest is capitalizing. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so with your federal student loans, the federal government has given you different ways that you can pay off that debt. When you first get out of the grace period that you have after you leave school, you are automatically put on what they call a standard repayment. That means that they expect for you to pay off whatever the debt is in 10 years. So what they do is they divide that debt, like let's say it's $100,000. They divide it by 10, and that becomes $10,000. That then means they divide it by 12 and they come up with your monthly payment. That's the standard payment. Usually most people can't afford that. That's fairly high. So the federal government has offered some repayment options. You can either use a balance-based repayment, such as the graduated and extended payments. Those basically take the balance that you owe and they change the amount that you pay each month, and it changes over the course, just kind of like a variable interest rate, or they make the loan longer than 10 years. The other options are what they call income-driven repayment options, and those are literally tied more or less to your income. So they look at your income and they decide more or less what's an affordable payment. Other ways to repay your federal loan debt is to consolidate the debt. And then the last one is what they call statutory discharge. And we're going to talk about each one of those. Okay, so if you decide that you want to use the graduated repayment plan, that will mean that you'll have low monthly payments and you'll pay off the loan in 10 years. But by the time that 8, 9, 10 year, your payments are going to be quite high. This is usually not a very attractive plan unless you think that your income is going to substantially increase over 10 years. Like I said, the extended repayment plan, it just makes your loan a longer loan period term, but it's the same payment every month. Only those on direct or using FFEL loans can take advantage of the extended repayment. And if you want to try to see what payment plan is the most affordable, you can go to studentaid.gov and there's an option to use their loan simulator. You basically put in your income and the loan, and it'll give you a rough calculation of what your expected monthly payments for each of the payment options. If you decide to use what they call the income-driven repayment plans, currently there are several plans available. That's going to change in July of 2028. But for right now, these are the plans that are available. PAYE, pay as you earn, income-based repayment, income contingent repayment. And then, of course, the SAVE plan is still there, but no one can sign up for it. So each of these has different amounts that they expect you to pay. The IBR plan is either a 20 or 25-year loan term, and the rest, and the ICR plan is a 25-year loan period. They look at different amounts of what they call your discretionary income. Discretionary income is based on the federal poverty level. That's about $30,000. So they say that, anything that you earn above $32,000-ish is considered discretionary income, and then they take a percentage of that. Typically, the most expensive plan here is the income contingent repayment plan because it has a lower limit on the federal poverty level, and then it takes 20% of your discretionary income above that. Usually the most affordable currently is the PAYE plan. And again, use that loan simulator if you want to look at what's actually estimated to be your monthly repayment plans. Okay, as I mentioned, there's what they call the SAVE plan, but because there's some litigation, there's some lawsuits, they have stopped the SAVE plan from being able to enroll, and there's many features associated with the court case. Basically, that they put everybody in forbearance, meaning you don't have to make payments. But as of August 1st of this year, those loans were starting to accrue interest while they're sitting in the forbearance, which means that, again, your loans get more expensive over time. Also, if you're in the SAVE forbearance, you're not getting any credit towards public service loan forgiveness. As I said, no one can apply for the SAVE plan. You can stay on the SAVE plan, but no one can actually apply. Um, if you are thinking that you're going to take advantage of the public service loan forgiveness, you're going to have to either get out of the SAVE plan or use this mechanism called buyback. As far as I know, we don't know anyone who successfully utilized the buyback program, but they say it is available. It's available for anyone who's worked 120 months for a qualified employer. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, there was also in July, there was news of what they called the Big Beautiful Bill that made substantial changes to the income-driven repayment plan. So the income-based repayment plan used to require showing that you had a financial hardship. That's no longer the case. Also, consolidated Parent Plus loans, they can now use IBR, but in order to do that, they first need to consolidate their Parent Plus loan, make one payment under income contingent repayment plan, and then you can apply for an income-based repayment plan. If anybody is out there who has a Parent Plus loan, I urge you to immediately seek consulting with legal aid, because there's some very big changes that are going to be coming about with Parent Plus loans. They're going to make it more and more difficult to repay those. So if you have Parent Plus loans, or even if you have consolidated Parent Plus loans, I would reach out and ask questions about what your options are on those loans going forward. On July 1st, 2026, there's going to be a new repayment plan called RAP, Repayment Assistant Plan, and there'll be a new standard. Remember, we talked about that standard plan being a 10-year plan. Well, there's going to be a new standard plan available. That standard plan is not going to be a fixed 10 years. It's going to be 10 to 25 years, depending on how much you owe. So someone who owes more than $100,000, their standard loan term, the amount of time they're going to be repaying on that loan, will turn out to be 25 years. It'll be a fixed payment, but it'll be 25 years paying it back. The RAP plan is a 30-year term. You pay it off for 30 years, and they look at 1 to 10% of the adjusted gross income. They no longer consider how much you earn above the federal poverty level. They just merely take your adjusted gross income. There's a few benefits of the RAP plan, which is if your payments are not paying off the interest that accrues, they will waive or cancel that interest that's not being paid off. And they will also match $50 for any of your dependent, and they'll subtract that from your loan payment. But those are dependents that you list on your federal tax returns. If you take out any new loans after July 1st, 2026 going forward, those will poison your existing loans, and you will be limited to just being able to have the standard or the RAP plan. So if you were, before that, you were on IBR, you won't be able to use IBR because you've taken out a new loan after July 1st, 2026. They want to confine you to these two possible plans. July 1st, 2028, I know this is a lot, but this is just the state of the art. But after July 1st, the only plans that will be available at all will be standard repayment, income-based repayment, and the RAP payment plans. Other changes that are affected by this bill that passed in July are you can no longer put your loans forbearance continuously. You can only utilize forbearance a maximum of 9 months in any 2-year period. The other the other advantage actually is you used to only be able to rehabilitate your loan once, but now effective next year, July 1st, 2027, you'll be able to rehabilitate your loan twice. And we're going to talk about what that means, what rehabilitation is. I'm just putting a summary here of the changes that came about with the reconciliation bill. And And if you do have Parent Plus loans, you must consolidate them before July 1st, 2026. Complete the consolidation before July 1st, 2026, or you will not be able to use anything other than the standard repayment plan. Okay. If you're on the save plan or you're thinking that you want to get off of the standard plan and get into an income-driven repayment plan, I suggest that you apply online. If you don't apply online and you decide you're going to submit a paper application, because of the current structure of the Department of Education, those applications are basically put on the slow train. They will take forever to get processed because they take manual intervention. And as you know, the Department of Education has been laying off and terminating the employment of thousands of employees. And so those jobs are just being handled by fewer and fewer people. So I really urge people to use the online application. It's on the studentaid.gov website. Typically, if you do apply for the income-driven repayment plan, I would reach out to your servicer and ask for a forbearance because typically that processing of the income-driven repayment plan takes a little bit of time. The first 60 days, you get a special forbearance, which means that you don't lose credit towards public service loan forgiveness or IDR. But after that 60 days, you're just going to have to continue to request forbearance if your income-driven repayment application has not been processed. They are processing the income-driven repayment applications pretty quickly now, but you never know. Things change pretty quickly with the Department of Education nowadays. If you do not, so if you're on an income-driven repayment application, you have to recertify every year. So the Department of Education wants to get an update on your income. And if you miss that 1 year annual recertification deadline, it can have serious consequences, particularly if you're on the income-based repayment plan, because as soon as you miss that certification deadline, your interest will capitalize and add to your debt, and then your loan will instantly become more expensive, and that will also mean that your monthly payments become more expensive. So be very, very careful. We're not sure that the Department of Education is letting people know when that annual deadline is approaching. So you should keep it on your calendar when you think that that deadline's coming about. And if you need help, again, reach out to legal aid. Those that have income-driven repayment and they get cancellation, meaning that their end of the term, either the 20 years for the payee plan or 25 years for income-based repayment and income contingent repayment, if your loans are canceled, that debt will be considered a taxable income according to the IRS. Any cancellation that comes about through the public service loan forgiveness program is not taxable. So what happens at the end of the term, whatever your debt is, let's say you have $100,000 in student loan debt and it's at the end of the 20 years for the payee plan, that entire debt is canceled. You don't owe it anymore, but it becomes an income-based taxable event as far as the the IRS concerns. And so up till now, they've not been treating that as taxable, but beginning January 1st, 2026, that will be considered taxable income. Okay, so some of the things that we talked about a little bit is the forbearance and the deferment. Be really careful because your loans are going to get more expensive. Anytime you're offered an option to postpone your monthly payment, you should consider the fact that maybe an income-driven repayment plan would make your loans a little bit more affordable. So, if you're really not sure, again, I suggest reaching out to legal aid and have someone look at your profile and figure out what's the most affordable way for you to reduce your monthly payments, but not have the impact of a loan that's getting more and more expensive. Also, watch out for anyone who suggests that you might have to pay fees for enrolling in forbearance programs. There's some scammers out there, and you should not have to pay any money for getting advice on how to manage your student loans. Your servicer should do that, the Department of Education. And again, you could always find legal aid to help you with managing your debt. Okay. So we mentioned earlier, now we're going to talk about if your loan's in default. Remember, if you're 270 days late on payments, you're now considered in default. How do you get out of default? Well, there's two options. One's rehabilitation, and the other option is consolidation. Consolidation is the quickest. You basically contact the default servicer, usually that's the default resolution group. You contact them, hi, I want to consolidate, and they'll give you instructions. Consolidation basically is essentially like a refinance. So they take your entire debt and they create a new loan with new interest rates, new loan term. So it's a totally new loan. The downside is that your defaulted loan that was in existence before you consolidated, that stays on your credit report and it shows that you were in default. It's very quick, but it does get you back into repayment quickly. And it also gets you out of default. Okay, so getting out of default using rehabilitation is a slower process, but your credit report will show that you actually fixed the loan and you were no longer delinquent. So rehabilitation, what that requires is 9 sequential payments, 9 months of payments without missing those payments. And then after that 9th month, you will be considered out of default. And you will then have rehabilitated your existing loan and you will maintain all the same terms of the existing loan. You can only currently, up until July 2026, you can only currently use the consolidation and rehabilitation one time. Like I said, after July 2026, you'll be able to rehabilitate twice, but you will not be able to consolidate twice. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the loan consolidation. As I said, it creates a new loan, new terms, new interest rate. It may mean that you are going to pay that loan off over a longer period of time, and it's going to be a more expensive loan. Again, you can reach out to legal aid, and they can help you figure out what might be the likelihood of that taking the place. You can consolidate a single loan. So if you have a Parent Plus loan, you have one Parent Plus loan, you can consolidate it and it becomes a direct loan. So you can consolidate a single loan. However, once you have a consolidated loan, you cannot consolidate that again, as I mentioned on the earlier slide. But you can take a consolidated loan and consolidate it with another loan. So it's a little bit complicated. I know this is. And it's somewhat a bit of a game to manage all this. So reach out to legal aid or ask advice from somebody who's knowledgeable, servicer or the Department of Education, to see how to figure out how to do this. If you consolidate a FFEL or Perkins loans, you want to be really careful because that will, or Parent Plus loans, that will affect the other loans that you consolidated with. So if you have direct loans and you consolidate them with the Parent Plus loan, it's essentially going to treat that consolidated loan as a Parent Plus based loan. Consolidated Parent Pluses loans can take advantage of income-driven repayment plans and therefore get credit towards public service loan forgiveness and those kind of things. Parent Plus loans do not get credit for public service loan forgiveness because you cannot get an IDR plan until you consolidate them. If you consolidate Parent Plus loans, you can either use the income-driven repayment plan or the income-based repayment plan. If you decide you are going to consolidate your loans, we urge you to certify your public service loan forgiveness certification, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But you should do that absolutely before you take the steps to consolidate your loan. Once you consolidate your loans, you should request the income-driven repayment plan, and you'll have to make a choice on which one. And then you'll be back into hopefully a somewhat affordable payments. Okay, so there's a couple of ways of getting your loans canceled other than using the income-driven repayment plan options with the fixed loan terms. There's the public service loan forgiveness program. There's total and permanent disability, closed school discharge, false certificate discharge, and borrower defense to repayment. Again, we're still just focusing on federal student loans, and we're going to walk through each of these options. Okay, public service loan forgiveness. That requires that you work for specific employers and if you do meet the other requirements, your loan will be canceled after 10 years. Remember the income base and the ICR plans, those both have 20 and 25-year loan terms. And this plan, your loans are canceled no matter how much debt you have after 10 years. You will get the entire remaining balance canceled. Okay, so the public service loan forgiveness requires that you work for a qualified employer. A qualified employer is either a 501c3 or the government. You must work a minimum of 30 hours per week. It could be a combination. You could work for a school, 20 hours per week, and the other 10 hours for a 501c3, but you must add up to 30 hours per week. Government employee, you could be a police officer at the police station, you could be dispatch, you could be the janitor for a school. It doesn't matter your position, it's dependent on the employer, the type of employer. Okay, what else do you need? You need to make 10 years of payments. They don't have to be, well, you have to make, I'll just say that. Let's just say you need to make 10 years, 120 months, and you have to be employed for those 120 months. So the two things have to be happening at the same time. You have to be working for the qualified employer, and at the same time, you have to be making payments. You can take a gap. You can work 5 years for a school system, a government employer, decide to go work for Microsoft or Apple or whoever, or go on vacation and stop working altogether. You can then come back and work for the government or a 501c3 and restart that goal towards the 10-year plan. So it doesn't have to be 10 years continuous. You can break it up, but the total must be 10 years. As I said, the Parent Plus loans will qualify if you consolidate them and apply for IDR. The nice thing about public service loan forgiveness, besides getting canceled after 10 years, is there are no tax consequences. You will not be considered as having earned a debt, or the debt that's canceled will not be considered as taxable income. Okay. It's a little tricky for those who are trying to get public service loan forgiveness during the SAVE litigation because you're in forbearance right now and you're not getting any credit for every month you're in that forbearance. How do you fix that? You can either get out of the SAVE plan by applying for another income-driven repayment plan, using the loan simulator to figure out what your monthly payments were, or you can exercise what they call PSLF buyback, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Okay, how does PSLF buyback work? Okay, what you do is you're literally buying back, making payments on the months that you were in forbearance, but were employed for a qualified employer. So let's say you've been working the 10 years for the qualified employer, but there were months, July, August, September, that you didn't make payments. So what you can do is after you reach that 10-year with the employer, you can make a request to the Department of Education that you want to pay for those months that you didn't make payments. What you do is you make this request, and you can make it through the studentaid.gov website. I put the link where you would reach out to do that. You tell the government you want to do that. Then what they do is they'll come back and tell you how much money you need to make for those months that you didn't make payments. And then you need to make that payment within 90 days. I do not, as I said, I belong to national coalitions. I've not heard of anyone who's successfully done this, although we're told that it is a thing, that it is available to people. I would imagine it's sort of a low priority for the Department of Education, but it's supposed to be available. The key is you must have already finished working for an employer for those 10 years. So don't try to do it unless you've actually worked for the employer for the full 10 years, again, with gaps and having worked elsewhere, but a total of 10 years. And I mentioned earlier that every year you should do the certificate. So if you are trying to achieve public service loan forgiveness, what we recommend is there's a certificate. Again, it's on studentaid.gov. What I recommend that you do is you pull down that certificate. You can do the entire process online. What you're basically is certifying that you have worked for a qualified employer. And what you can do is if you have your employer's email address, you can actually ask that the form be sent to your employer online and certified that way. So there's no paper involved, and that's an extremely fast process. So We recommend that you submit your public service loan certificate either once a year if you're staying at the same employer, or if you change employers, that you do it before you leave the former employer. If you're going to ask for that 120 payment, you're done, you think you've met all the requirements, you must be employed by a qualified employer when you submit that final public service loan forgiveness employment certificate form. If you retire or you leave the employer and you submit the certificate, it will be denied and you will not get that final cancellation. Okay, here's some of the other programs that will allow your loans to be forgiven. The federal government has the teacher loan forgiveness program. It doesn't forgive your entire debt. It only forgives 17,500. It looks for particular requirements. It wants that you are teaching either math or science in a secondary school. They also want you to be working at a school that's designated as a rural or inner city. You can go online to see which schools might qualify for this. If you don't teach math or science, the maximum forgiveness is $5,000. California has another program to help those who are employed in the medical professional, healthcare professionals, such as physicians, dentists, nurse practitioners. What that program does is, as long as you've been working in that field for 2 years, maximum 4 years, they will give you a grant for your first year. They'll grant you $50,000 for the first year, and by the time you get to your fourth year, the maximum grant is $10,000 to wipe out some of your student loan debt. And I've got links for where you can look to see how you can apply for those grants. Okay, we talked about statutory discharge. Statutory just means it's imprinted in the law. So there's several other ways to get your loans canceled, because there's laws that Congress, the U.S. Congress, enacted, just recognizing that certain federal student loan borrowers should have their loans discharged, or canceled is another word for discharge. So if you went to a school that closed while you were in the middle of attending and you never were really able to graduate, or you withdrew before the school closed, 180 days, if you withdrew before July or after July 2020 and the school closed, you can request that your federal loans be canceled through the studentaid.gov website. If you then if let's say the school closed, but you then re-enrolled in another school and were able to get your degree, you cannot get your student loans discharged. It only happens if you were not able to get your the degree that you were enrolled for. Okay. The second way to get your loans discharged is called ability to benefit. So let's say you enrolled in the college, you told them that you had a felony, a criminal felony, but the program required that you couldn't have a felony in order to get whatever, the certificate or the graduation. So that meant that you were deceived to some degree in thinking that even though you had this walking into the school and they knew about it, they led you to believe that you were going to be successful in getting the certificate. So the federal government has said that you shouldn't have to have federal student loan debt if that was your situation. And so what you need to do is prove that the college accepted you knowing that you had something that would have made it difficult for you to get the certificate, and then eventually you can get your student loans canceled. The third way is what they call total and permanent disability. That means that if you become disabled to the point where they don't think that you're going to be able to work in the future, or you were disabled because of veteran services, or you're on SSDI, you can request to get your federal student loans discharged through the Total and Permanent Disability Discharge Program. It's a bit of a mess right now. It used to run pretty smoothly. It seems to be maybe getting better, but it has been really, really difficult. It's taking a very long time to get these discharges through that program, but I wouldn't hesitate to go forward if you find yourself in that situation. And again, if any of these you're having difficulty, reach out to legal aid and see if they can assist you with getting these processed. Okay. There's some closed school discharge that the federal government has recognized. They're just clearly these schools were schools that closed, and the federal government has a history of that. They're going to pretty much automatically grant you your closed school discharge for these schools that I've listed here. Again, reach out to legal aid if you attended any of these schools and you're having difficulty getting your closed school discharge application granted. If you need assistance, because these schools have been already recognized as having closed and denied people their ability to get their education completed. Okay, there's another way that people have been able to get some of their federal loans canceled or discharged. It's called borrower defense. Those are typically situations where the school lied to you about what the education that they offered would provide for you, such as they were promising that you'd get an incredible job at an incredible pay, that you might not need to go to the school for 2 years, but unfortunately it ended up taking you 4 years. So any kind of false or lies that they told you before you enrolled that kind of encourage you to get involved with that school. You can complete what they call a borrower defense application. It's a very lengthy process because they need you to prove that there were lies, promises made to you that turned out not to be true. So the more information you've got, like if you can show websites or emails, the more evidence that you have of what was told to you, and then the other side of that being how you can show that it turned out not to be true, the stronger your borrower defense application is going to be. We have been told, well, my experience with working with people is the borrower defense applications are taking a very long time to be reviewed by the Department of Education. Some of the people I'm working with have been told it's going to be 3 years before they even hear whether the Department of Education has made a decision on their application. But if you think you qualify for this situation, I would still apply. There's some other discharges that the Department of Education has recognized this were bad schools, and they don't really need to see a lot of evidence from you because they've already seen it through lawsuits or attorney general's actions. And if you went to any of these schools, you should get more or less an automatic discharge. But again, if you're having difficulty, I would reach out to legal aid and see if they can assist you to expedite your application. Okay, now we're going to talk about private student loans. Private student loans, like I said earlier, they have a completely different path and the way that they're treated. Okay, so if you have a private student loan and you stop making payments, you'll become delinquent just like you would with federal loans, but typically the lender will charge the debt off, meaning they don't want to manage it anymore, but it doesn't mean you don't owe the money. They've literally just given the debt to what they call a debt buyer. So that debt buyer is going to want to collect on that debt. They typically will file a lawsuit because their goal is to get a court to order you to make the payment to them. And then they can attach that judgment over and over and over pretty much forever. They can keep re-upping that judgment and you will have that hanging over you forever. So very, very important. If you have private student loans and you end up seeing that a lawsuit's been filed against you, you need to take action right away. You have a very short window to respond. And even if you don't think you have any other option and you really, there's no chance that you're going to get out from having to pay it, you should file an answer. Otherwise, you'll get what they call a default judgment. Default judgment gives you very little options to challenge whether that debt was valid. So if you get made aware that there's a lawsuit that's been filed, I urge you to reach out immediately to legal aid or a lawyer or somebody to help you manage how to respond to that lawsuit. Okay, so if you do have private student loans and you're having difficulty making payments, there's not a lot of the options that the federal loan offers, such as the income-driven repayment plans and whatnot. Really, your only option if you have a private student loan is to look at financing the debt. And if you're considering doing that, it's a good idea to have someone look at the offer to make sure that the refinance is really going to be beneficial to you, because you don't want to end up paying more for a loan because you refinance. Once you refinance a loan, it's really hard to go back and complain about the original loan that you had. Okay, I just want to go briefly because if you're in debt collection, you do have certain rights that the debt collector has to be very careful how they treat you. If they're calling you constantly, you can let them know that that's not okay. You can tell them you only want to communicate in writing. There's certain hours that they can't call you. They can't threaten you. They can't lie to you and say that you owe like 50,000 when you really owe 20,000. They can't tell your friends or your boss or your neighbors, hey, Joe Smo has a debt and I'm trying to find them. They can ask your friends and neighbors, how to make contact with you, but they can't say that you owe like a $50,000 debt and you're behind on your payments. That's not okay. If that is something that you've experienced, again, I would reach out to a lawyer or legal aid and see if you can get some assistance with that. Okay. Just general rules of the road about anyone who calls you on the phone and talks to you about debt or any kind of wants to get information like your social security or bank account numbers, passwords. Do not do that over the phone. Just ask them to send you something in writing. You could look at it, digest it, see if it's something that makes sense, is legitimate, but do not give out any of that information over the phone. You should want to keep good records. Anytime somebody makes a phone call to you, get their name, write down the time, the date. If they said anything threatening or harassing, you want to make note of that because then you can possibly use it later as a defense. Keep copies of things. Don't throw away these kind of letters because it'll give you dates when they start reaching out. It might affect your ability to get the debt wiped out or how you defend a lawsuit. Do open your mail. A lot of these debt collectors will send you things by mail. Some of the things that the federal government will send you will be by mail, and legal aid will be able to tell you what to watch out for, like consolidations. They typically send you something in the mail after you've consolidated. So I know most of us don't use our U.S. Post Office that often, but with delinquencies on student loan debt, you do really need to stay on top of the communications, and they will send you things through the U.S. mail. Okay, really big caveat, do not pay anyone for assistance with your student loans, even if they're private student loans. You do not want to pay for somebody. There's a lot of scammers out there. There's a lot of options for you. There's legal aid. There's the student loan servicer. Don't get sucked into paying somebody who's going to, quote, help you with your student loan debt. You do not want to pay anybody. All right, so just be really careful. Also, be really aware of the fact that once you become delinquent, you want to immediately take action. Even if you don't think you have options, it's not a bad idea to check out whether you, in fact, really do. Things are changing quite rapidly. You don't want to get in a situation where your wages are already starting to get garnished. That hasn't happened yet, but the Department of Education is gearing up for that. And that's any day now, they're going to start garnishing people's wages. Okay, yes, you can discharge your student loans, both private and federal, in bankruptcy. You need to show to the court certain things, such as you can't maintain your standard of living because of your student loan debt, and you've tried to make payments, but you just can't do it. It's a little bit complicated. It's not a guarantee, but if you have a bankruptcy attorney, they should be able to ask the court to show that you have an undue hardship and see if they can get your private and federal loans discharged through bankruptcy. Okay, California has what they call a student borrower bill of rights. There's extra protections on how servicers for your student loan treat you. They must respond to you if you make a request in 30 days. They've got to give you clear and accurate information. A bunch of stuff here. It also allows you to sue a servicer if they have violated the California Student Borrower Bill of Rights. Again, you could look online for this, or you can reach out to a lawyer or student legal aid to see if maybe you've got some ability to fight the servicer using a legal action. Okay, here's some resources. We at HERA have some publications. There's the Student Loan Borrower Assistance website, and then there's the Project on Predatory Student Loan Lending. They do a lot of complaints against private lenders, and they also sue the federal government. There's some lawsuits out there now that they're actively pursuing some of the policies the Department of Education is moving towards. The studentaid.gov website is a very, very useful website if you have federal loans. I would urge you to register, do that handshake, and in about a week, you'll have access to that website. All right, I know we're getting close to the end. Let's see if we've got any questions. And I will stop sharing my screen and stop the recording. Okay, let's see. Are there any questions in the chat? Nope, there isn't any. Oh, wait, you mentioned legal aid can help us. How do we get up an appointment with legal aid to get support? You could reach out to us at HERA and see if there's you can make an appointment. If you'd prefer to use a different service, a different legal aid society, you can contact